pleasure for me to welcome among us Professor Joakim Nivre from Sweden, more precisely Uppsala and Stockholm. I think that I don't actually need to introduce you among our audience, but nevertheless, I must say that I have found a wonderful sentence in one of your CVs, which did not appear on our invitation, but I must say that I like this characterization. And it's in I, so you write about yourself.
Okay.
I try to understand natural language from a computational perspective. And I think this perfectly fits to our, to this place, so to say. So I don't need to emphasize that our contacts have been pretty long. I really don't remember the first time. I remember the place, but not the year where we met for the first time. Just one thing is I would like to mention Professor Nivre was the president of the ACL in 2017, and he was awarded a medal prize of a distinguished service for the ACL Association for Computational Linguistics. So this, I think, is one of our very I don't know how to say that, representative lecture in the Jelinek series of lectures. You are most welcome, and we are looking forward to your talk.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm really happy to be here and this time talking about 10 years of university. Now, the fact is that I've been giving talks with roughly this title for almost a year now. So you may actually wonder when exactly is UD turning 10 years? And I tried to find out more precisely. And of course, there are different ways of measuring the birth of a project like this. But I think my current opinion is that the 10th birthday of UD is actually this Saturday, the 27th of April. When we had a meeting in Gothenburg where at least Jan was also present, I know. Of all the birthday talks I've given, this is, I think, the real birthday talk. And it gives me special pleasure to give this talk here in Prague at UFAL, which is probably the organization in the world that has contributed tree banking and linguistic annotation in general, but also in particular to the Universal Dependencies project, and is still doing so. Of course, that means that many of you are already very knowledgeable about this, so you will probably sort of some of the things that I will say will not be at all new to you. So I have to ask you to want to assume that everyone is necessarily deeply acquainted with dependencies. So let's start from the beginning. What is universal dependencies? Well, if you go to the Universal Dependencies website, to the section Introduction to UD, you can learn that it's a project developing cross-linguistically consistent tree annotation for many languages with the goal of facilitating multilingual parser development, cross-lingual learning, and parsing research from a language perspective. Maybe also trying to understand natural computational perspective. Thanks for reminding me of that phrase. I think this is an accurate description of the project, maybe especially at the time when it started, but over the years it's evolved in various ways, and I think it's true to say that it's not just a project, it's also an annotation scheme, a data repository, and arguably now a research community. So, and I want to talk about each of these aspects in turn. But before I do that, I can't resist the temptation of taking a stroll down memory lane and tell you the story of how UD came to be. It's a story that goes back than 10 years. Again, there are probably different ways of telling this story. Here is my personal view of the things. And for me, this started in 2006 with the first Connell shared task on multilingual dependency parsing. And I want to take this opportunity to acknowledge a huge debt that the community actually knows to these four people who have not actually got a lot of recognition in the field of parsing and tree banking: Sabine, Amit, Yuval, and Erwin. They were the organizing committee for the shared task, and they managed to do two amazing things. First, they managed to collect tree dependencies for no less than 13 languages, which was an amazing achievement at the time. Not only that, they also came up with a standardized format for storing these tree bank and making them available to parsers, despite them all having a scheme, the so-called Connell X format, which in some, though it's now changed its last letter to U in Connell U. Now, actually the same year was also the first thing called Stanford Dependencies, which was not really an annotation scheme. It was rather something like a front end to a syntactic parser, because in those days, at least for parsers, were not dependency parsers. They were phrase structure parsers. Natural language understanding applications actually preferred to have dependency representations because they were more useful. So this developed as a way of converting essential structure parsers to a kind of dependency representation. Now, the following year, my colleague Roy McDonald and I needed to do an empirical error analysis, analyzing the results of the first task. We wanted to compare the error profiles of different parsers. And one of the things we wanted to do was say something about how they dealt with different types of linguistic expressions and constructions. So we wanted, for example, errors across part-of-speech tags. Now, that turned out to be almost impossible to do with those data sets because every language had its own annotation scheme. So in the end, we managed, after 15 different annotation guidelines, to create a very coarse-grained mapping to a few categories. Well, you can probably not read this, but it's verb, noun, pronoun, etc. Probably all very fuzzy. Now, at about the same time, Dan Zeman, of course, is in the audience, principled way, or probably a much more principled way than we did, by developing this system called interset, which, as it says on the slide, is a nearly universal set of features that could be used to map between different speech tags in a more principled way. A few years later, Google released the sort of version of this or variant of this, which the so-called Google Universal Part-of-Speech Tag, which was a system of 12 categories that also came with mappings from different well-known part-of-speech tag sets. And incidentally, this system was sort of loosely based on the preliminary mapping that we did for the error analysis in 2007. Now, meanwhile, here in Prague, Dan and other people had taken step further and started looking into harmonizing not only part-of-speech annotations, but also dependency annotations, the syntactic representation. And we had the Hamlet project and Hamlet section of treebank, which was harmonizing dependency treebank essentially by converting them to a version of the Prague dependency treebank scheme. Now, the year after, again, Ryan and I and some other people had a similar idea. So we released what at the time was called the Universal Dependency Treebanks, not to be confused with Universal Dependencies, where we used a version of the Stanford Dependencies together with the Google Universal Part-of-Speech Tag. We were very happy to receive a retrospective test last year for this. And this immediately prompted a reaction from our colleagues at Stanford, who liked the idea of having universal Stanford dependencies, but didn't quite like some of the decisions that we had made in this scheme. They wrote this paper and eventually hijacked me into becoming a co-author of that paper. So I was on both sides of the debate, if you like. And we had the universal Stanford dependencies. And this is sort of the time when we said, we have to put a stop to this. It's wonderful that so many people want to harmonize annotations, but can't we agree on a single standard instead of having multiple standards? So that's when we called this meeting in Gothenburg that I referred to, where we sat down and worked intensely for a few months after that, and eventually released the first version of the Guidelines of Universal Dependencies, which in some sense is a merger of Universal Stanford Dependencies, the Google Universal Part-of-Speech tags, the interset morphological features, but all of them, of course, have been revised and harmonized further on to form a somewhat coherent system together. Now, in January 2015, we saw the first release of guidelines, of course, hosted, as they still are, by Lindat here in Prague. The following year, we released the second version of the guidelines, fixing, hopefully, some of the most obvious mistakes in the first version. And again, most of this was actually worked out at a meeting here in Prague. So you can see the sort of thread going through this. 2017 was a very productive year for UD. This is a slide from the closing session of the first UD workshop, which is a workshop that has been held annually since. It will be held again next month in connection with Elric Colling in Turin, for those of you who are going there. We also had the first tutorial on universal dependencies at EACL in Valencia. And we saw the first of two new shared tasks on dependency parsing, this time under the title From Raw Text Shared Task, where everything started, at least for me, but now with standardized all the way from raw text to the final representations. Now, here is a figure created by our colleague Philip Ginter, trying to illustrate the impact these two shared tasks, so there were one in 2017, one in 2018, had on the community. And again, I know you can't see the detail, but essentially what this graph shows is on the x-axis, the amount of data that is available for a given language before and after these shared tasks. And on the y-axis, we have the best recorded parsing accuracy for that language. So every pair of dots here is a language. And what you can see essentially is that all languages improved on at least one of these dimensions, and most of them on both of them. In 2020, we reached the milestone of having more than 100 languages represented in UD, and also saw the launch of a second series of shared tasks, this time parsing into the so-called enhanced dependencies, which is this enriched representation. Which is available for a subset of the languages, and which in some sense sort of has similarities to the tectogrammatical representation in the PDT framework. And finally, in 2022, we didn't new version of the guidelines, but we adopted a set of new policies that would allow us to incrementally update the guidelines without necessarily having a completely new version. Okay, so much about the history. So let's say a few words about the UD annotation scheme. And as I said at the beginning, I know some of this is very familiar to some of you, but just it will be important for things that come later on. So let's go through it again. So the basic requirements that we started with was, of course, the goal was to have cross-linguistically consistent morphosyntactic annotations so that we could make meaningful comparisons between languages in the way that we couldn't do in 2006 and 2007. And in this way, to support multilingual research in NLP and linguistics. We thought it was a good idea to try to build such a system on existing de facto standards, like the Stanford dependencies, interset, and so on. And I think the development since has shown that it was probably a good idea because people were more ready to adopt it that way. At least I always like to emphasize that UD has be a complement rather than a replacement of language-specific scheme. Because doing things at the cross-linguistic universal level inevitably means that you have to simplify, abstract, and sort of lose some of the information about individual languages. So if you're really interested in all the details of the morphosyntax language, it's a reputational scheme for that. But if you're interested in making sort of meaningful comparison across languages, it can be a help. The basic philosophy has often been described as trying to maximize parallelism between languages, that is, bring out the similarities when they do exist, and do not let them be obscured by different sort of annotation schemes, but don't overdo it. Don't try to make all languages look the same, because all languages aren't the same when it comes to the morphosyntactic structure. So we're aiming for something like a universal taxonomy with language-specific elaboration, and I will come back to exactly how that works in practice. So two basic design principles that we also often cite. One is to use dependency or direct syntactic relations between words as the basic way of representing syntax, rather than phrase structure or other conceivable representation. It was very much a sort of practical choice, because at that time it was already widely system, but also because it was available in treebanks for many languages. And to a large extent, I would say that that's due to the influence that the Prague dependency treebank had, which had already also been applied to many languages. The second principle, which is one that I will return to later in the talk, is this that has sometimes been described as the assumption of lexicalism, or if you like, a strict separation between morphology and syntax, which in this context means that the basic annotation units are words, not morphemes or such units. These words have morphological properties, or if you like, morphological structure, and this is represented in an annotation layer that we call the morphological layer, basically through features, and I will again show examples. And these words enter into syntactic relations with other words, and that is captured in another annotation layer through dependency relations. And of course, when I say words here, it's important to stress that this is a sort of linguistically informed notion of syntactic word, not orthographic word, what happens to be between two spaces in a given writing system, for example, or for that matter, phonological words. And that brings me to, and of course, this means that in order to annotate any language in UD, you need to figure out how to segment sentences into words. And this has turned out to be one of the most challenging aspects of achieving cross-linguistic consistency here. And we still don't have sort of very good universal criteria for this. Of course, some linguists would tell you that it's impossible to find universal criteria. But then some linguists will change their mind and say the opposite. So we don't know. We try to provide at least some simple rules of thumb. So one is that a word should have a single part of speech tag. So if you look at something and say, it functions as a preposition, but there's also an article in there, then you may not be looking at one word, but maybe the fusion of two words. But on the other hand, a word should also have, sorry, a real syntactic relation. So if all you can say about a segment is that it's an inflectional morpheme of another word, then it's probably also not a word. So, but in order to make this as transparent as possible, UD has from the start has this possibility of essentially doing segmentation at two levels, a more surface-oriented thing that we typically call orthographic tokens, and which really only makes sense for languages that spaces and punctuation to mark words, and then the more linguistically informed syntactic words, which are the ones that are actually part of the annotation. So just to give you some simple examples here, in French, there is this character sequence AUX, which is definitely a single orthographic token in French. It has spaces around it, but which syntactically speaking is the fusion of a preposition and an article. And for the purposes of annotation, it makes sense to actually segment it into those two items. In Spanish, if you say, oh, give it to me, again, it's written as a single sort of string without spaces, but linguistically speaking, it's a verb and two pronouns. So that's an example of clitic pronouns. If we go to a language like Hebrew, things get a little more complex. Hebrew still uses spaces, but they tend to put between the spaces than we would in most European languages. So this string, and I hope I remember this right now because I don't really read or speak Hebrew, means and that in the sun. So it's a coordinating conjunction, a preposition, a pronoun, no, sorry, coordinating conjunction, pronoun, preposition, article, and then a lexical step. And of course, there are languages that don't use spaces at all. So in a language like Japanese, you would have to insert some kind of segmentation like this to make it amenable to annotation in UD. Okay, assuming that we have the words in the morphological annotation layer, which I'm going to illustrate with a French example, le chat chasse les chiens, the cat chases the dogs. We can assign to each word a lemma representing the base form of the word as you would expect. And of course, these are language specific, so UD doesn't have a lot to say about how those should look. But then we have the part-of-speech tags, which use this revised and extended version of the Google Universal Part-of-Speech tags. There are 17 part-of-speech tags. They can be broadly divided into open class words, closed class words, and special things like punctuation and other symbols that you may occur in text. This is a fixed inventory. You cannot invent new part-of-speech tag. If you do, it's not UD anymore. But every language does not have to use all the part-of-speech tags. So for example, if a language doesn't have a grammaticalized distinction between common nouns and proper nouns, it can just use the noun tag, right? For most languages, this only provides a very coarse-grained classification of words, which is why the second element, or third, if you include the lemmas of the morphological annotation, are features representing various lexical or grammatical properties of either the lemma or the inflected form. So for French nouns, you would encode gender and number. For verbs, you would have, in addition, things like tense and finiteness and person, and so on. And again, there is a universal inventory of features. These are the ones that are currently part of that. For each feature, there is also an inventory of possible values with the definitions. But unlike the part-of-speech tag set, this is an extendable set, because as new languages are added in UD, we often find the need for either new features or more commonly new values of features, and then they can be added. And as soon as a feature or feature value is used in several languages, it can also be sort of included in the universal part, but you can always have language-specific features if they are needed. Okay, so much about the morphology. Let's move on to the syntax. And as I already said, syntax is based on dependencies, but it's a favor of dependencies, which some theoretical linguists are not too happy about. We will see. And the basic idea is that UD prioritizes having direct dependency relation between content words, or words that function as predicates, modifiers, arguments, because that increases the chances of these relations being parallel across languages, whereas things encoded function words are more likely to not be encoded with function words in another language. It could be morphology, or it could be nothing at all, right? So in a sentence like the English, the cat could have chased the dogs down the street, the assumption is that the main predicate is chased, the main verb. It has a subject dependent, where the most important word is cat, an object dependent, dogs, and then an oblique or location modifier, where the noun street is the main example. Function words are then attached to the content word that they modify. So determiners go with noun, auxiliaries go with verbs, and even a preposition like down in English is essentially treated as a case marker on the noun or nominal rather than as the head of a prepositional phrase, perhaps the most controversial aspects of UD syntax. There are a few others like it. If you want to include punctuation in the annotation, there are guidelines for that too, but I won't go into them here and now. But I do want to just use one more slide at emphasizing why we're doing syntax in this way that many linguists find weird. And I'm illustrating here now with an example in English, Swedish, and Czech. I hope I got the Czech correct. Otherwise, I'm sure someone can correct me. And they are sort of basically translational equivalents here. And the point here is that if we take these dependency relations between content words as basic, then these sentences have exactly the same structure, which I think is a correct observation. So there is, in this case, a passive predicate, there is a passive subject, and there is an oblique agent phrase indicating the agent of the action. Now, what differs across these languages, and it differs in different way for different categories, is how you encode additional grammatical information about these. So if we start with definiteness, definiteness is encoded in English using a separate function word, an article. In Swedish, through a morphological inflection, the suffix n marks definiteness. And in Czech, it's not encoded at all because it's not grammaticalized, right? If we go to the passive, it is a periphrastic construction in English consisting of an auxiliary and a participle. It is, again, a morphological inflection in Swedish, at least as one of the two options that exist in Swedish. And in Czech, I've been told that it's actually a combination of the two, because there is an auxiliary, but the particular participle form here is unique to the passive construction. So it's somehow encoded in the participle as well, which isn't in English, because of course this participle can be used in many other functions too. And finally, when we come to the agent phrase, Swedish and English are similar in that they use a preposition here, whereas Czech uses the instrumental case. All right, so in total, in order to do the syntactic representation, UD in version 2 has an inventory of 37 universal relations. I won't have time to go through them all, but let me just say that they are organized by 2 or maybe 3 principles. The first is that you look at the form of the dependent. So is it a nominal or noun phrase? Is it a clause? Is it a modifier word, or is it a function word? And that gives you sort of 4 different columns here. But it's also organized by the head and what kind of relation is. So there are separate relations for core arguments of predicates, for non-core dependents of predicates, and for dependents of nominals. And then in the bottom row, there is everything else that you need to do real tree banking, including coordination, which of course is a very respectable linguistic, but also relations for dealing with things like typos and disfluencies in speech and so on. So these 37 universal syntactic relations are like the part of speech tags in that you cannot invent any of your own. You have to use these. But you can add language-specific subtypes of those. So if you want to make finer distinctions, that's possible. Okay, so much about the UD annotation scheme. So a few words about the UD repository. I don't think any of us who started this project could have imagined 10 years ago that when we started with treebanks for 10 languages, that in the latest release, which came in November 2023, and which, as usual, came largely thanks to Dan Zeman's very consistent and dedicated efforts into making sure that all the treebanks are correctly validated. We have 259 treebanks representing 148 languages and 31 language families. Of course, it's also important to say that this is possible only thanks to the fact that nearly 600 people around the world now have contributed data or other efforts to UD. And altogether, this is something like a little more than 30 million words, which of course is not a lot if you compare to the kinds of data sets that large language. But since it's linguistically annotated corpora, I think it's very impressive. Now, if you look at what languages are in UD, it's inevitably skewed towards the Indo-European family, as you might expect. But over time, it has become gradually more balanced. We started with 80% Indo-European languages. We're now down to, I think, 47%, so less than half. Similarly, if you look inside the Indo-European family, there are, of course, some branches that dominate, in particular Slavic, Germanic, and Romance historically. But also here, over time, we have sort of seen more and more contribution from other branches. Now, if you look at it this way, it may look very nice, but there's also another view on the data. And one way of looking at it is like this. This represented the sizes of different treebanks. And you can see that there are a few really big ones, the biggest one being a German tree bank with nearly 3.5 million words. And of course, the Prague dependency tree bank in its UD version is also one of the big ones here. But the overwhelming majority of tree banks are very small. In fact, the median size of a UD tree bank has been gradually decreasing over time and is now below 30,000 words. Now, this doesn't mean that these tree banks are not valuable. Some of them are extremely valuable. They may be the first annotated corpus that exists for a language. But it does mean that for some of the traditional use cases of UD resources, like training parsers or sort of getting statistics on word order typology, it's not clear that they are all that useful. So I think this is one of the real challenges that we face in the future. Here's another way of looking at this, thanks to our colleague Francis Tyers, who created this map, which shows the approximate geographic locations of languages represented in UD. Of course, this is not exact. I mean, English is here. It could be in many other places. But nevertheless, and it also uses color to represent the amount of data available for that language, with dark blue being big tree banks, light green being smaller tree banks. And of course, this makes it very, very clear that UD is extremely Eurocentric, not only in terms of number of languages, but even more so in terms of the amount of data that is available for those languages. The last aspect I promised to talk about is the UD community, which is very loosely organized in a way. At the center, you have the Universal Guidelines Group, which currently consists of 17 people. This has changed a little bit over time, but by and large, the majority of people here are still people that were there from the start. And the Universal Guidelines Group, which nowadays have monthly meetings, are responsible for maintaining and developing the Universal Guidelines and also for ensuring the validation of all tree banks that are released in UD. And there, of course, the most important person is Dan, as I already mentioned. We then have the equally important larger group of tree bank developers, the close to 600 people that I mentioned on the previous slide, that take responsibility each for their own tree banks, but also for the language-specific documentation that should come with each tree bank. But then there is arguably an even larger use these banks for various things, for NLP research, maybe even for technical development, but increasingly, as we shall, so for other types of research. So when I first started giving these birthday talks, I wanted to learn a little more about what goes on in this larger group. What are people actually using UD resources first? And I approached that problem by doing a literature survey. And a literature survey using Google Scholar. So everything has to be taken with big bags of salt, especially any exact numbers. But I think the overall trends are probably still somewhat representative. So what I did was, and again, it's hard to read here, I searched for any article that contains the exact phrase universal dependencies anywhere in the article. And that turned out to be much more precise than I thought after going through lots of examples manually. Yes, there are articles in medicine or biology that accidentally talk about universal dependencies, but they are surprisingly few. So that gave me sort of the basic quantitative statistics here. And again, we know that the numbers cannot be trusted. They're probably inflated, but I think, again, the overall trend. So what we see is a very clear sort of increase over the years in the number of papers that refer to universal dependencies. What is happening over here is not completely clear, whether it's the beginning of a decline or whether it's just a plateau. We know that all the statistics about 2023 is not in yet. I mean, these things are still getting updated. So maybe if we're lucky, we're sort of on a flat surface here, or maybe interest is decreasing a little bit. It wouldn't be surprising if, of course, if you take into account the recent developments in the world of NLP and the way that people now develop NLP systems. But then I wanted to know a little bit more about what is actually in these papers. So I started going through manually, not all of them, or at least not yet, but 20%, a sample of 20% of the articles from each year. And again, this is arguably a biased sample because I took the top 20% according to the Google Scholar ranking, and I don't know exactly what that based on, but appearing in the title seems to be one thing that puts it high up. And then I classified them using 6 broad categories into the type of research. The first one in blue being papers that talk about universal guidelines, tools, and framework. Not necessarily only the UD guidelines, but maybe other sort of alternative frameworks, but that refer to UD. Or whether that's just a fluke. The second category in green is on language-specific guidelines and treebanks. So the prototypical paper here is a paper entitled A UD Treebank of X, where X is a language, and very often a language that has not had a treebank before, and certainly not a UD treebank. Now, and this again seems to be a category that is increasing in size. And when I started giving these talks, I didn't have the statistics for 2023. So I was saying that this is now actually the most important category. And again, I have no idea whether I should be worried about the 2023 or again, whether this is a fluke or not. But it seems that at least until a year ago, people were very happy to still do UD treebanks and publish papers about them. The third category in yellow are grouping together what I call morphosyntactic and semantic parsing. So anything sort of using this to build what we used to call, or what we now call, the classical NLP pipeline, with sort of tokenization, part-of-speech tagging, parsing, and so on, which in some sense is the use case that UD was originally designed for. And we see that this has for many years been the dominant category. And we think we can see a boost here in 2017 with the first Connell shared task, and then increasing, but then quite predictably, again, given recent developments in NLP, decreasing a little bit. In red, we have papers talking about downstream tasks in a very wide sense, anything that isn't parsing, but is sort of NLP application. And that seems to have picked up a little later than the parsing tasks. I thought it was declining, again, because people don't develop NLP systems using parsers anymore, but then who knows what's going on here. In purple is an interesting category, linguistic research. And again, that's a very broad category, but it means not trying to build an NLP system, but finding out things about language. A lot of this is language typology, people using these tree banks to study, for example, word order typology. And that clearly seems to be a category that is increasing. And the very last one, I couldn't resist including a category on interpretability of NLP models. But of course, this should read large language models, which is this study where people use probing techniques and data from universal dependencies to find out whether multilingual BERT really knows anything about syntax, and similar papers. And this, again, is still a small category, but it also seems to be increasing. So where are we now? On the positive side, I think it's undeniable that there has been an amazing development in terms of growth when it comes to contributors and tree banks, a growth that I think none of us could really imagine when we started the project. And I think the survey that I've shown is that at least for these 10 years, the data sets have actually been quite widely used for research in both NLP and linguistics. At the same time, we have to acknowledge that there are challenges. One of them have to do with the data itself. I pointed out to you that data sets are very uneven in terms of quantity, and this is a real challenge. I didn't say so much about quality, but we know that there are differences there as well. So when it comes to annotation consistency, actual real compliance to the guidelines, things that can't necessarily be checked by the automatic validator, despite all of Dan's efforts, there is some variation there. Again, I've alluded to large language models and other recent developments in NLP a couple of times. And one of the things that of course shows is that relevance to the research community is not something that can be taken for granted. It does seem to some extent to be complemented by an increasing interest from the sort of more traditional linguistic community, which is very nice and which was not sort of really what we aimed at first, but it's constantly something to think about. And then I think we also need to be honest and say that there are probably some things about the annotation scheme itself, and in addition, the way that it is documented in the guidelines on the web, that is not optimal for actually getting people to do the best possible job of applying it consistently across languages. And what I thought I would do in order to give you something new, in addition to all the old stuff for the last 10 minutes or so, maybe 15, is actually say a few words about this, about some ideas for possibly changing or improving the annotation scheme and its documentation, maybe even starting to thinking that there could be a version 3 of the guidelines. And in fact, that is the real reason why, or well, at least an additional reason why. So I'm actually in Prague now on a 2-week short-term scientific mission funded by the Unidive Cost Action, Unidive, to talk to people, in particular to Dan, about starting thinking, if we're going to release a version 3 of the guidelines, how should it be different from version 2? So everything is very tentative, but I welcome any feedback that you have on these thoughts. So first of all, I want to return to what I earlier called one of the basic design decisions of UD. The fact that this strict separation between morphology and syntax, and on top of that, the fact that morphology and syntax are encoded by different mechanisms. So morphology is all about properties encoded as features. So things like number is plural or case is nominative and so on. And syntax is, on the other hand, encoded in terms of relations between words, and only that, right? So there are no syntactic features except the ones that reside in words. And over the sort of lifespan of the project so far, a number of issues have sort of come up in relation to this assumption. One is this one that I already mentioned, that it seems to be really hard to establish universal criteria for word segmentation for languages ranging all the way from isolating languages in Southeast Asia to polysynthetic languages that basically put everything into a single word, or what corresponds to a full sentence in many other languages can be a single word. Another aspect of this is that people have suggested that sometimes this lexicalist assumption that morphological structure is inaccessible to syntactic relations is actually not true. So people have proposed that in some cases, syntactic relation may actually involve parts of words rather than complete words. And conversely, or to target the other, that morphosyntactic properties that we may want to encode in the annotation sometimes actually do not reside at the word level, but can only be sort of attributed to larger unit. So we have observed sort of mismatches, if you like, between these assumptions. And what we're now trying to understand is what is the nature of these mismatches and what mechanism would be needed to deal with them. So one language that often comes up in this context is Turkish, which has a very productive system of derivations that often seems to correspond to multiple word in English. So this is a Turkish sentence meaning the ones in the blue car are sleeping. And the way it works is that araba is car. And what you can do in Turkish is you can first inflect it by adding a locative case marker. So you get in car. And then you can use this thing that at least some people describe as a derivational suffix, which creates, well, it's a nominalizer, but it takes a noun and gives you another noun, meaning one in car or something like that. And then you can add another layer of inflection, in this case plural, so you get the ones in the car. The problem here, of course, is that once you attach the adjective blue here, you get the wrong compositional interpretation, because it's not the people sleeping in the car that are blue, it's only the car that is blue, right? So this seems to suggest that at least you would need to separate these two. And so you get arabada, which is in car, and the car is blue. And then you get, probably some kind of nominal modification relation. So the ones that are plural are in the car or in the blue car, and they are sleeping, right? The question is, what is going on here? Is it the fact that we actually have two syntactic words here in Turkish, although they happen to be written as one? Or does it mean that we actually need to posit syntactic units that are smaller than words? Another phenomena that often comes up is noun incorporation. So this is an example from Chukchi, where a sentence meaning something like then we climb the hill again. It consists of three words. The first two are adverbs expressing roughly then again, and then all the action is in the verb here, right? That's where you have the subject encoding by agreement suffixes. But more importantly, you actually have a noun in here, which is the object hill. So again, comparing to other languages, and this thinks about making parallel, there seems to be an object relation that is not represented here. So again, it has been suggested that maybe we need to recognize that there is a noun sitting inside this word, which will actually function as the object of this verb. But if we do this segmentation, it turns out that we have inflectional affixes on both sides of this. So what do we do with that? Because those are probably not things we want to treat as words. And so this has led to the suggestions that maybe we need to do a complete morphological segmentation, and maybe UD trees should be done over a sequence of morphs rather than over a word. And of course, you can do the same thing for Turkish if you really like. So, so figuring out what is going on here and what minimal extensions we could make to UD to make sure that we can adequately represent those linguistic constructions. And we have discussed many different options during last week. Still no firm conclusion. The other type of mismatch I mentioned, we can illustrate even in English very easily, which is this fact that we sometimes want to assign features or properties or to things that are larger than words. So if we look at fixed expressions like by and large in English, which even though it's written as three separate words, is a completely frozen unit where the internal syntax doesn't tell you anything about what it means anymore. The way UD currently handles that is to have a sort of special relation fixed, which is just saying you should think of this as a single word with spaces in it, but so this is not a real syntactic dependency relation. But of course, we still have part of speech tags saying that it's a preposition, a conjunction, and an adjective, which isn't very meaningful. So this is clearly a case where you would like to be able to say that this frozen unit with spaces in it is actually an adverb in modern English. And at least official UD does not allow you to do that yet, although people have found ways of including that information. Another example are periphrastic tenses or other periphrastic constructions, something like has done, the so-called perfect in English, right? The current UD annotation will tell you that the auxiliary has is present tense. It will also tell you that done is a past participle, but nothing in the annotation will tell you that this is the perfect tense or perfect aspect, depending on how you look at it. So again, it would be nice to be able to say that this whole unit consisting of 2 syntactic words actually expresses this property. And once we're at it, wouldn't it be nice to be able to say that this whole sentence is a declarative, which is actually, I think, one of the most glaring omissions of UD, that we don't have basic clause types like declarative, interrogative, and so on, because it's hard, at least for many languages, to put them at a particular word, because there's nothing about, you could put it on the verb actually, but there's nothing about the form of the verb itself that tells you whether it's interrogative or declarative. It's more global property of the word order of the sentence as a whole. So this has led people like Dan to, in a recent abstract submitted to the Unidive meeting that we had last year, to suggest that maybe UD needs both subword relations and superword features. And I realize now that I have drawn the arrow completely the wrong way. So sorry. Of course, the subword relations are down here and the superword features are up there. Too late in the evening, probably. Yeah. Anyway, I think you get the message. But if we move over to the syntactic relations, there are clearly a lot of questions that have been raised here as well. One, more generally, is whether the UD taxonomy makes the right distinctions from a typological perspective of being able to distinguish and meaningfully represent relations in many languages. And in some cases, people seem to suggest that UD is making too fine distinctions, being universal. So again, inherited from Stanford dependencies, we have separate relations for nominal subjects and clausal subjects. And many people would be much happier if we had a single subject relation, especially when you're dealing with things like participles and gerunds, and where it's hard to tell whether it's a clause or a noun or a verb or some other thing. The object versus the direct object versus indirect object is another one that has caused a lot of headache, and it's probably not used completely consistently across languages. And the linguistic typologist Bill Croft have suggested that making these fine distinctions between numeral modifiers, adjectival modifiers, adverbial modifiers, and maybe a few others may be fine for European languages, but many types of languages across the world have other distinctions. So maybe a single modifier category, possibly with subtypes that could be adapted to different language, might serve us better here. And that brings us to the question of to what extent sort of UD is still biased towards what linguists used to call standard average European in its categories. So again, Bill Croft in a paper a few years back suggested that it's good that UD have special relations for these function words that can be attached to content words. So things like coordinating conjunctions, subordinating conjunctions, auxiliaries, copula, determiners, case markers when they are realized as prepositions, classifiers in Southeast Asian languages. But there are at least two that he would like to see added to the link. One is what he called index, which is indexation, or if you prefer, agreement, when it's realized as a separate word, but doesn't have any other syntactic relation with that. And the other is what typologists call linkers, which are words that link two words together, but without expressing the kind of information that case markers typically do. So currently, I guess we're using determiners for this, and we're using case for this typically, but that's the kind of thing that typologists may not be entirely happy about. Of course, if we think seriously about doing some of the things that I showed on previous slides, like segmenting things into smaller units than words, maybe all the way to morphs, that might create the need for new types, especially, I think, if we think about derivation. I think for many cases, inflectional affixes can probably be handled to a large extent with existing grammatical relations. Derivation, I think, is a partly different thing. And finally, this notion of a language-specific subtype that I said. I haven't said very much about it, but I said there are 37 universal relations. You can add language-specific subtypes. What I didn't say is that in any specific instance, so you really have to think carefully about what information is most important. And the other day I had a look at existing subtypes in the UD treebanks, and I found that some treebank uses clitic as a subtype of auxiliary. Yeah, that seems useful to say that an auxiliary is clitic. But then again, there is also a subtype that says that the auxiliary is expresses passive. So what happens if you have a clitic passive auxiliary? Well, you can't have your cake and eat it. Unfortunately, in current UD, you have to decide which information is most important. And maybe that's not ideal. So maybe you would like to have some more expressive feature system here, similar to the one that we have for morphological classification, that where you're able to say both of these things. Finally, it's UD is currently a bit sort of on the fence about the status of this subtypes, in that officially all subtypes are optional. You can build a UD tree bank and only use the 37 universal relation. If you don't want to subclassify, fine, no one will complain. But on the other hand, we say at various points in the guidelines that if a language has relative clauses, which not all languages have, but if they do, please mark that as the subtype of adnominal clauses. So that's essentially saying that all subtypes are optional, but some subtypes are less optional than others, to paraphrase a famous novel. And I don't think this is really an ideal situation. So I think there are clearly room for improvements here. Last but not least, I'll try to be quick here to save some time for question. Given that we are considering many potential changes here, we also need to think about how this is going to be represented in the actual file formats. So this is the CONL-U format. It is a simple sort of tab-separated value format, evolved from the CONL-X that I started with in my historical overview. It's extremely simple, and that is one of its main attractions. Everyone understands it, everyone can use it, and over time people have got very creative in putting a lot of information here that was not envisaged. But if we are really thinking about new linguistic units, features, and relation, we also need to think about how we can do this. Also, something that I think we should have thought about sooner, and I take some of the blame for this. What about additional annotation layers, like named entities, like semantic roles, like co-reference, and so on? There were early on suggestions for adding this as layers to UD, and I usually pushed back saying, look, we have enough work to figure out the morphology and syntax. Let other people do that on top of UD if they want. And of course, people have been doing that, and that's great. But the fact that we didn't provide guidelines for how to do it means that many people have done it in different ways. So we now lack uniformity there. So maybe we should have been better on that. And if, in fact, there is already a specification for an extended format called CONL-U+ that allows you to add any additional number of columns here where you can encode information. And finally, something that is really important in NLP and software development generally, what to do about backward compatibility. I think the reason why most people don't use the CONL-U+ format, but instead cram a lot of information in this famous or infamous 10th column here called MISC, the miscellaneous, which is the only place in this format where you can put whatever you like as long as you do it with the right syntax, is because if they do that, then they know that any of their favorite tools will work because it will work on CONL-U. All right, I think I'll stop there. As I said, I'll be very happy to get feedback on any of this or questions on anything of else, but I have to end the way I always end when I'm giving a presentation on UD by thanking all the UD contributors. Without them, UD literally would not exist. Thank you.